So my name is Nick Tomlin. I'm an engineer on the Revenue Growth Tools team at Netflix. Before we get started and dive in, I have a question that I actually posed on the Netflix Slack, but I'm just interested in what image you picture when you think of Conductor, and specifically Netflix Conductor. So you can hold on to those. I'll try to revisit this later on in the talk, but I'll also share mine later on in the talk too. So yeah. Now, just diving into a brief outline of what I hope to cover today. I want to share a little bit about the context and domain that my team is working in, how we've built on top of Conductor to try to solve some of the problems that we've identified, and then share a brief case study to just kind of walk through assembling those pieces together, as well as a few opportunities and hopes for the future. So my context and my team's context. My team serves the financial backbone of Netflix. So you can think about things like recurring billing, making sure that someone is able to pay for their Netflix subscription every month, that we don't double bill you, hopefully. Processing payments, holding onto your membership details and doing partner integrations. All those teams that are focused on accomplishing that goal to make sure that you have a successful journey as a customer and Netflix continues to make money. Those are our stakeholders. And what we're trying to do is empower those engineers to focus on the core systems, their specialty, with full stack tools that help them answer needs for stakeholders or debug data better, anything they can do to just be more effective as engineers at Netflix. And one of the things that I love specifically about working at Netflix is that there's a really clear alignment between folks on the business side, so operations and analyst teams, and folks on the engineering side that make up the product team. So this makes meetings where there are tough decisions a lot easier because everyone ultimately wants what's best for Netflix. There isn't a lot of infighting or discussion, a lot of disagreement, and that makes for, I think, a really effective organization. Unfortunately, there is a bridge between these two domains, the human world and the system world, when it comes to how things actually get done. Human operations business teams tend to be a lot more dynamic and conversational. They work in things like Slack and Excel or Google Sheets, send emails, schedule meetings. And this is natural. It maps the grain of their domain, and that's good to observe that. But it is different on the service side. Teams think about performance, architectures, they speak gRPC or JSON. And so bridging these two gaps can be difficult when you need to make an important change for business. So something like administering configuration, perhaps, for example, changing a tax rate around the world might involve a lot of back and forth. And some of that is necessary. You need to work with, say, like local tax authorities, and it's just, going to be a manual process. But there are a lot of pieces that could be automated. And at times this burden falls on the shoulders of engineers to really just direct this whole process. And so in the past, it's been up to them to either create self-service tooling to automate this, or to create scripts, or just play go-between. And while I think that's really good for keeping certain teams agile, especially as things are developing, it doesn't scale well as you want to grow the business dramatically. And so our hope is to really empower engineers to self-service. And so we identified some core needs that our stakeholders had after just walking through the process of building some tooling with them and sitting alongside them and seeing operationally what their needs are. And those are that a solution needed to integrate into existing tools and workflows. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't walling users off from working in the way that they ultimately wanted to work, not forcing, say, business users to go into a BPML tool and model everything or work within a specific suite. They could still kind of do the things that they needed to do in the domains that they were expert in, but also preserving the ability to talk to services. And again, making sure that architecture for those microservice teams, they could focus on modeling that in the best way and really just playing this connective layer between the human world and the system world. So we wanted to meet people where they were at and have a more organic solution that could bridge those two worlds. We wanted to make sure that engineers could automate the manual business steps when they made sense. So providing a way to just encode business processes, but again, preserve the freedom to do what's best for Netflix and not have to be forced to automate every single thing. Sometimes something maybe needs to be manual or needs to be a script when writing a microservice for just one thing would be overkill. And finally, most importantly for our context right now is just orchestrating system tasks. We knew that uniting these two worlds would mean we needed an orchestrator and something that we could rely on to talk to microservices. So we could guarantee to our stakeholders that when they've sort of set up this workflow, that it would execute, that it would be durable, that they could retry and observe it. And that was, a core building block to this. It's not enough to just provide a form or UI. We need to rely on something to really orchestrate it. And we didn't want to write that piece ourselves, obviously. So we created a tool called Flows. It's an internal tool, not open source, unfortunately, but that try to do all these things, to play this bridge and really allow engineers to express themselves and build products that they could be proud of internally, instead of having to fall back to, kind of manual ad hoc scripts or having to rewrite services for tooling all the time. And the way that it works is that engineers, provide some configuration. Right now, it's YAML based, but we are exploring different menus in the future. But they would sort of encode the business level steps of this. You can think of a workflow that bridges, the human and the system domains. So things that map naturally to how we think about how stuff gets done. Something is waiting for approval, it's approved, it's in progress, and then it's done, or it fails. But we won't talk about that today. And then the transitions are just bridges between these states. So when something goes from awaiting to approval to approved, the transition is called approved. And what we've layered on top of this is a way to express a configurable UI to collect this data and attach it to a transition. So, clicking a button to approve is good, but a team might want to collect a reason for the approval or some metadata around that. Do they expedite it? And so giving our engineers a way to express that without having to rely on a UI engineer to write a form just unleashes them to do more faster. And also on the flip side, this is not really shown, but we can attach this data to states. So you could think of someone who is looking to approve something, they need to save some data pulled from a system. And so we have some primitive to just express, tabular data and other formats that are helpful for these either engineers or business users that are looking to do approval or interact with the workflow in some way. And so after something has transitioned, as part of that, we can hook into Conductor workflows to send an email and make an HTTP call. And this is all sort of facilitated by a state management service that is maintained by the Conductor team. So delineating these state machines, we've just sort of built a schema on top of that. And then some Conductor hooks in to do this. So the end result is that starting with a YAML, engineers get a state machine, they get a gateway into Conductor and a configurable UI in one place. So the idea again is to just empower them to build these products in the same way that they would build another software toolkit, something that they can rely on, something that frees them up and focuses on the needs of the business rather than on the minutia of writing kind of service or workflow code again and again and again as the business scales out. So I'll just go into some more specifics of how we work with Conductor to accomplish this for engineers. The first piece is just having a CLI-based workflow for development. Because our stakeholders are engineers, we don't need to necessarily have as much of a non-engineer focus. And so we want to meet people where they're at. And often engineers are pretty comfortable working in an editor and working with a command line. So although Maros's UI I think is pretty sweet, so I would love to steal that or use the open source version of it. And I think there are also some opportunities here on the Orcus and Conductor side coming up, which are pretty exciting. But for us, what we've done is just create a workflow to run a Conductor definition that's stored on the user's file system, and then open it up in the Conductor UI. And this gives you sort of a REPL-like feel, especially if you're debugging things like transformations or JQ. You can just get into a flow where you're editing, seeing what it looks like, and not having to go, manually go through a bunch of steps to make that happen. And also in the development phase, we have hooks to do things like just upload a workflow or task definition. A lot of the simple stuff that you'd be doing, having to switch to a UI, it's actually nice to have it in the command line right where you're working. So that's the sort of the development piece using the Conductor APIs, but we also are using Git flow for managing delivery. Again, we're trying to map to the way that engineers think about code. And since these configurations are mission critical and often maybe need some oversight or review, having it actually go through, say, like a PR phase and being stored in Git is actually pretty useful for teams. So, they can develop locally with the CLI, push and get automated feedback on validations that we can run over the conductor JSON or the state machine YAMLs, and have conversations around their workflows, and then merge it in, and we do the work to play that out onto the various systems where that config needs to be delivered. And in general, I think this pattern of kind of treating glue code or workflows as an important piece of software makes a lot of sense and has resonated with a lot of our users. So I think the tooling here can get just better and better and better, but overall these things are playing such an important role in us as a business that I see this just being a good pattern that I think I want to lean into. And I think it's really worth calling out the new Conductor UI as being an essential part of this toolkit. We have our own UI that can kind of merge the state machine definitions and the configurable displays, but we often just link out to Conductor. And this is great for our engineering stakeholders because they just have a great way of seeing what's going on, and also performing operations on the workflows themselves to restart or debug. And the end result is we don't have to do as much support for them, which is great. And they are just free to often solve their own problems without having reached us or even the Conductor team. Again, I think it's just been massive to leverage this. I had a coworker the other day talking about how much he valued using the UI. And that was great for me because I didn't have to do the work to build it. I could just benefit from it. And I think the investment here has paid off, and I can see hopefully that's paying off with everyone in the open source community too. So to talk a little bit more about the way that we're leveraging Conductor workflows and Conductor's JSON config language, what we've tried to do is expose as many generic patterns within workflows that our stakeholders can use as possible. So a lot of our users start out without writing any custom Conductor workflows at all. They just reference workflows that we've written. But to do things like do an HTTP pipeline. So make an HTTP request, but first transform the body with a JQ expression, pipe it to an HTTP task, do some asserts on the status code of the body, and then maybe do a final transformation. Stuff that I've done a lot myself, writing Conductor workflows, but we try to elevate these patterns once we identify them into something that they can just take off the shelf. And that's provided, I think, just a lot of utility and showcases kind of the dynamism that I think is a huge asset for Conductor. But as part of this strategy is really, we want to build almost like provide a platform, these building blocks, where if a generic workflow, which ideally can solve most people's use cases, isn't good enough, then they can rely on combining these generic tasks into custom workflows. So some of our stakeholders just own Conductor JSON. They don't own tasks because they're just using custom workflows with the business logic of Conductor and some of our tasks to get things done. But we always want to provide that flexibility for them to eject out and just write their own custom task in a worker if they really need to. And this sort of spectrum of customization, I think, is really helpful for users because we're relying on the flexibility of the Conductor platform to make sure that we're never boxing users in to a certain way of doing things. They can always sort of connect out and still be in the same system, the same mindset. And that I think has just been huge for knowing that we can say yes to people. And that yes doesn't mean that we're having to build a lot of custom stuff. The yes is really like, you can do it and you can do it with Conductor. And as part of that, I think our stakeholders just amaze us with what they can accomplish. Things that we didn't even think about or know, they're able to just go out and do. And that, to me, as someone who builds tooling for engineers, is the most important part of this, is that the system, I think, is facilitates that discovery and creation and just lets people express themselves, which is ultimately what I want to see and what I love about working with Conductor. It is worth mentioning alternatives here because I think the space is crowded and in some ways in a good way, because this is an important thing. But I want to just talk through briefly, things that we considered. We thought about DIYing with Spring Batch or some other processing frameworks, but I think we'd fall prey to the issues of just reinventing the wheel, and also lose out again on a lot of the tooling and debugging that is important to our users. So we kind of eliminated that pretty early on. We thought about BPML or enterprise automation frameworks, things like Camunda, but the vendor lock-in there I think was a tough sell for us, just because you invest a lot in someone's platform and ultimately that platform is closed to you and you're sort of dependent on them entirely. and you miss out on a lot of those open source benefits. And our target was engineers. So we didn't need all of the things that the batteries that were included in those solutions. We wanted to be a little bit closer to the metal because we could, and it's actually in our benefit, I think. And finally, temporal or cadence, as it used to be called, is really exciting. I think there's a lot here in terms of the code as config, or code as workflow config. It's really interesting to us. But I think at the time, the DevX experience and the UI specifically just wasn't up to snuff, as well as we're building a pretty dynamic platform, so we needed the dynamism that Conductor provides, and having everything be very focused on code, I think, was a little limiting for us. So I'm interested to see how this grows and ways that this can influence Conductor, but ultimately I think Conductor is the best solution. Yeah, just to restate, the DSL is great. The dynamic definitions have been wonderful for us, and building this platforming, and then the fact that we it's battle hardened. We can just throw anything that we want at it and just trust that Conductor can handle it is great. That I love being able to guarantee that to my users and just rely on that. And then finally, I think the community, especially with Orcus coming onto the scene, is really exciting, and we all benefit from innovations outside. So I love to see the two sort of worlds informing each other. Awesome. So really briefly, I kind of talked about the product that we're trying to solve. I'm not going to do a full demo because I never trust demos, but I want to try to just thread the different pieces together to show how someone might assemble one of these workflows. So typically, if you want to solve a problem, say collecting a CSV and running it through a batch process, you'd start with a form. And we have a way of building forms with a configurable YAML DSL. And you get a file input that just shows up. A user can click on it and upload it. And then we handle this with a specialized S3 bucket that's able to talk to our UI and then pass things through to our Conductor tasks. It would also provide some configuration on talking to Conductor. So you can see this RGT bulk HTTP workflow. That's one of those generic workflows that I talked about before, where users don't have to write any code and they get the benefit of looping through every line in the CSV and making an HTTP request, which is a really common pattern in our world. But again, if they wanted to do something different, they'd have the same primitives to build the same thing with a Conductor workflow of their own. So we would, when a user submits the form, we would grab the input, grab any details from the form, and ship this to that specialized worker. Process it in Conductor with the same observability kind of insights that Conductor gives you for free, and some custom payload stuff that we've done, and then display this to the user in the UI. And this is seamless to business users, but engineers are always able to drop down into the Conductor world and see how things are executing, retry tasks, and do the debugging there if they need to. But the end result is that that data from Conductor gets pulled into our UI, and users use the same configurable UI patterns to display it if they want. So they can display like a sort of a flat table structure, a filterable data table, as well as exposing some download buttons to grab a CSV if they want to handle the data that way. And again, because we're leveraging Conductor, a lot of these patterns are really extendable. So if something doesn't work for a user, they're able to just eject out of our generic workflows and start mixing and matching these tasks to build some complicated workflows of their own. And again, this is an area where I think our users have amazed us with how much they're able to do with this and not actually write any code. It's just with Conductor and some of these UI primitives. So, really this is accomplishing that goal of just trying to make sure that engineers can own these products and feel like they're developing something that's meaningful and solid, but not really have to invest in an entirely different architecture, entirely different world to just do automation. So it frees them up to focus on stuff, and it empowers business users to do what's best for the business. Great. I wanted to just end briefly talking about a little bit of some hopes that we have for the future and some potential patterns that might be interesting as well. So I think one of the things that we've seen is getting engineers into the Conductor flow as fast as possible is great. And we want to just figure out ways to reduce the barrier to getting business logic out. So the container pattern that Maros mentioned, I think, is a really interesting one, or other ways of just doing like a serverless model where users can just be focused on their business logic and not have to deal as much with different sort of config styles and wiring that together, making that as easy as possible is really important to us. We want to just make sure that there's a way to rapidly development. So, our CLI tooling works right now, but I think there's a lot of developments in the UI space coming, I think actually coming hopefully pretty soon, that will make this even easier. And we want to leverage those to just make it possible for engineers to develop these things just like they would develop software for other production systems. And finally, I think we want to just figure out ways to promote discovery and reuse. So Maris's tagging example, I think, is really awesome. But other ways of attaching metadata to these things, maybe input or output types, like a strongly typed layer on top, where we could say this thing pipes into this thing, or the output of this is useful to this task. That way, again, it just assists users in wiring things together and making it a smoother development story. So for a final thing, I kind of want to return to my original question of what image you picture when you think of conductors. I think we'll try to just share this in the chat and then do Q&A in the Q&A. But I'm kind of interested if we all go towards one image or if there's a range. When we did this on Netflix Slack, there was actually a range of images. So go ahead and share this now in chat if you feel comfortable. And I'll just go on to my own image in a little bit.
We've got one person in the, so we've got a musical performance, a conductor in front of an orchestra. And the one before that is a decision-based one like Black Mirror Bandersnatch, which I have to admit I haven't watched, but it does appear that it is streaming on a popular video streaming service that has an N for its logo. So I just checked that out. So it's on my list of things to watch because I don't understand that analogy, to be completely honest.
I actually haven't seen it either, but thanks Anu for the shout out. This has really just been an elaborate ad for Bandersnatch and Netflix subscription. So we accomplished our goal. Awesome. Yeah. My image is a conductor. I've heard of a train conductor or, like a circuit as well. But I think that matches this one, what comes to mind. And I can think of like a workflow as maybe a piece of music and the sections of music like tasks and the workers as musicians. I'm not a musician, a classically trained musician, so maybe that's a terrible analogy, but yeah, I think that maps a lot to how I think about these things. And what it's interesting to me is, when you think about, I always think about movie production, like probably because I work at Netflix, but the ways that different parts of a business play these different roles. So a conductor might be focused, or a musical conductor might be focused on the score for a movie, but you have a choreographer focused on fight scenes or stunts, a cinematographer focused on the camera angles and making sure that that's smooth. And so really, like, a lot of these things become like conductors being conducted, and piecing those things together is something that I've been trying to do it, and I've seen other teams at Netflix do. And so I'm interested in opportunities in this space to provide a kind of companion to Conductor, to do the work that we're doing to kind of bridge these human worlds with system worlds. And how, like, I think Spike on the Conductor team at Netflix has called this a director. I think that's a really good kind of name for it, because the director oversees the whole production. And they're trying these different, expert kind of conductors together. So I don't really have a proposal here. I'm not sure what it looks like for the open source world, but I'd love to play around with this idea. And if anyone has thoughts or ideas here, or you've built something like this internally, I'm really interested in just kind of hearing about them and how that's worked for you. So, great, thanks for listening. I think we have a few minutes for Q&A, so we'll do that now.
I muted myself, sorry. There's some time for question if anyone has some questions. There have been a bunch of questions in the Q&A that are more conductor based. And so thank you to the Orcus team and the Netflix team for keeping the Q&A going while Nick was presenting. We've got another person, a capo and ultra. Oh, choreography versus orchestration for football fans. I'm going to have to watch that as well. I'll collect all of the things that were shared in the chat and in the Q&A, and we'll put all that together in a blog post as well and share all of those details with everybody at the end of the meetup.